Ensisheim, eastern France, approximately 5000 BCE, 3000 years before the Egyptians will build the pyramids. A man walks through a Neolithic settlement. He is roughly 50 years old. He has survived longer than most people in his community. He has also survived something else. There are two holes in his skull. The first, near the front, has closed over completely. Smooth bone covers the opening. The second is larger, nearly 4 inches wide. It is still healing. New growth creeps inward from the edges, but the gap remains. Someone opened this man's skull, twice, and both times he lived. No written language exists, no metal tools, no medicine as any modern definition would recognize it. But someone in this settlement picked up a piece of sharpened flint and performed brain surgery. This is his case file. Trepanation, the surgical removal of a piece of skull bone without damaging the brain beneath, is the oldest confirmed surgical procedure in human history. Not bloodletting, not amputation, a deliberate, controlled opening of the cranial vault. More than 1,500 trepanned skulls have been recovered on every inhabited continent. Europe, South America, Africa, China, the Pacific Islands. At Neolithic sites in France, 5 to 10% of all excavated skulls show evidence of the procedure. For most of recorded history, no one in the modern world knew this. The holes in ancient skulls were dismissed as battle injuries, animal damage, or post-mortem decay. The possibility that prehistoric people had performed brain surgery was not considered. It was not considered because it was, to the scientists of the 19th century, unthinkable. That changed because of one skull, one archaeologist, and one anatomist who was willing to look at the evidence and accept what it meant. In the early 1860s, a man named Ephraim George Squire traveled to Cuzco, Peru. He was an American newspaper editor, author, and self-taught archaeologist. Abraham Lincoln had appointed him U.S. Commissioner to Peru. While there, he visited the home of a wealthy collector of antiquities who showed him a skull. It had been excavated from an Inca cemetery in the valley of Yucay. It was pre-Columbian, centuries old, and at the top of the cranium there was a large rectangular hole. The edges were clean, precise. Cross-hatched cut marks surrounded the opening. This was not an injury. Squire examined the bone closely and found what he believed to be signs of healing. New growth around the rim. The patient had survived the procedure, at least for a time. He brought the skull to New York in 1865 and presented it to the New York Academy of Medicine. The members agreed the hole was man-made, but several argued there was no proof it had been made while the patient was alive. They suggested it was a post-mortem ritual. An ancient curiosity, nothing more. Squire disagreed. He sent the skull across the Atlantic to Paris, to the leading authority on the human skull in Europe, Paul Broca. Broca had founded the Société d'Anthropologie de Paris. He had discovered the speech center of the brain, still known as Broca's area. If anyone could settle the question, it was Broca. In 1867, Broca examined the skull. His conclusion was unequivocal. The hole was surgical. The bone had healed. The patient had been alive during the procedure and had survived for at least 1 to 2 weeks afterward. There were signs of inflammation. Further proof that the body's immune response had engaged after surgery. Broca published his findings. The scientific community was forced to confront a possibility that had been dismissed without examination. That people who predated the Greeks, the Egyptians, the invention of writing itself, had developed a surgical technique sophisticated enough to open the skull and keep the patient alive. In the years that followed, the evidence multiplied. At a Neolithic burial site in central France, excavators uncovered multiple skulls with round holes 2 to 3 inches wide. The edges were scalloped, scraped with a sharp stone. And beside the skulls, they found something unexpected. Small bone discs, the same diameter as the holes, with tiny perforations drilled through them. The discs were amulets. Communities had kept the bone fragments removed during trepanation, drilled holes through them, and strung them as talismans. These were not discarded surgical waste. They were objects of significance, cut from the heads of people who had survived brain surgery. The procedure, it became clear, was not rare, and it was not confined to one civilization or one century. It was everywhere. In ancient Peru, the evidence was most abundant. Over 800 trepanned skulls have been recovered from Peruvian sites, spanning 2,000 years. The techniques varied, scraping with obsidian, cutting intersecting lines with a tumi, a curved ceremonial knife, or drilling rings of small holes and removing the central disc. Some patients bore multiple trepanation sites. They had undergone the procedure more than once and survived each time. The question that shaped the next century of study was not whether trepanation happened, it was how well it worked. In 2018, neurologist David Kushner at the University of Miami and anthropologist John Verano at Tulane University published the largest comparative study of trepanation outcomes ever conducted. They analyzed more than 800 trepanned skulls from Peru, spanning from 400 BCE to the end of the Inca Empire around 1500 CE. Survival was determined by a single indicator: bone healings around the trepanation site. Smooth, remodeled edges meant the patient had lived for months or years after the procedure. Sharp, unhealed edges meant they had died during or shortly after surgery. The results traced a clear arc of improvement. Among the earlier skulls, dated to 400 to 200 BCE, roughly 40% of patients survived. By 1000 to 1400 CE, survival rates had climbed as high as 91% in some samples. During the Inca period, 1400 to 1500 CE, the average survival rate stabilized at 75 to 83%. Then Kushner compared those numbers to a very different set of records. American Civil War battlefield hospitals, 400 years later. Civil War surgeons operated with metal instruments, formal medical training, and some understanding of anatomy. They performed cranial surgery to remove bone fragments from gunshot and artillery wounds. Their mortality rate was 46 to 56%. More than half their patients died. Inca surgeons, using stone and bronze tools, no formal training system as modern medicine would define it, and no knowledge of germ theory, had achieved survival rates nearly double those of 19th century doctors. The critical boundary in trepanation is the dura mater, the tough membrane between the skull and the brain. If the surgeon perforated it, the risk of hemorrhage and infection rose sharply. Over centuries, Peruvian practitioners appear to have learned this. Later trepanations show smaller openings, shallower cuts, and careful avoidance of areas where the skull is thinnest and bleeding is heaviest. The difference was not technology. It was accumulated knowledge. Inca surgeons had 2,000 years of institutional memory, encoded not in textbooks, but in apprenticeship, practice, and observation. Civil War surgeons had formal training and battlefields contaminated with bacteria they could not see and did not yet understand. Trepanation did not disappear, it evolved. The modern craniotomy, the controlled surgical opening of the skull to access the brain, is the same operation, performed with anaesthesia, sterile instruments, and imaging guidance. The geometry has not changed in 7,000 years. In western Kenya, among the Gusii people of Kisii district, traditional trepanation continued into the 20th century. In 1966, a Western physician witnessed a 4-hour procedure performed under a tree without anaesthesia. The practitioner cleaned a razor blade and homemade instruments with soap and water, cut an X on the patient's shaved head, drew back the skin, and scraped the skull with a hooked knife. The documented fatality rate, approximately 5%. By the early 21st century, no young practitioner had taken up the apprenticeship. A continuous line of surgical knowledge, stretching back further than any written record, appears to have broken in a single generation. The practice also surfaced in unexpected places. In 1965, a Dutch former medical student named Hugo Bart Hughes drilled a hole in his own skull with a foot-operated dental drill. He claimed the procedure expanded consciousness by restoring blood flow to the brain. He was committed to a psychiatric institution. His associate, Amanda Fielding, ran for British Parliament on a platform of making trepanation available on the National Health Service. She received 139 votes out of more than 40,000 cast. 7,000 years ago, a man in eastern France underwent 2 brain surgeries performed with a sharpened stone. He survived both. No one wrote it down. No one recorded the surgeon's name. The only evidence is the bone itself, healed shut, holding a procedure older than civilization. One question for the comments. At what point does a technique practiced for 7,000 years stop being primitive? The next case on this channel, a president's sister, a single surgical procedure, and a family that made sure nobody asked questions. This is the sealed ward.